let's get started. We're going to focus today on this new project, which in one way is very much in line with the range of work that you've done, Professor Brook, in the past, and that is it's very much attuned to China as a part of global patterns, global phenomena. But in other ways, it feels for me as a bit of a departure, because so much of your work has been pretty squarely cultural history. And this brings you into two very different realms of economic history and climate history. So I wonder if you might start off by just telling us a little bit about how you came to this project.
Thank you, Ryan. That's a great question, and that's where I would like to begin. I started collecting prices, commodity prices in the Ming Dynasty, back when I wrote The Confusions of Pleasure in the 1990s. And I thought, if I don't know what things cost, I can't reconstruct what the everyday life of ordinary people in the Ming Dynasty was. I started collecting prices, but it turned out to be a hugely impossible task because we don't have much in the way of price lists. We have a few state price lists. But in the course of looking for prices, I came across data in local gazetteers. And that, it was an unusual price data. It was the price to which grain rose during a famine. And I started to collect this data. Anytime I walked into a Chinese library, I'd pull a gazetteer off the shelf and see what I could find. And as these prices accumulated, I began to develop, it's the largest data set I have of prices in the Ming Dynasty. Well, a couple of years ago, I started to write a book about prices in the Ming Dynasty. And I was interested not so much as an economic historian, but as a social and cultural historian. What did prices mean? What could people afford? What did you have to earn in order to afford those prices? So I started doing that. I wrote a great, huge manuscript that I found immensely boring, and I'm sure readers would have found it too. And then I realized, wait a minute, my best data are the prices to which grain rose during famines. So why not build a book around that, to pare away the other stuff and just focus in on the prices? And once I lined those prices up chronologically, what hit me was that the crises that drove prices through the roof through the Ming Dynasty responded almost perfectly with our chronology of the Little Ice Age. And I thought, okay, I'm going to have to shift my focus. My data has taken me to climate history. I can't stand back from climate history anymore. I've got to figure out what is the relationship between what's happening in China with grain prices and the Little Ice Age. And that's how the book came about. It wasn't a book I ever planned to write. I kind of stumbled into it in the course of doing my research. And actually, I'm glad I did it because, as you noted, I like to relate China to the world. I like to think about what's going on in China in relationship with what's going on elsewhere, whether it's through connection, whether it's through a common chronology. And this was a case in which what China was going through in the Ming Dynasty was pretty close to what Europe was going through during the same centuries.
So, of course, these price increases all come, or let's say cluster, at a particular time in the history of the Ming that you allude to in your title, The Price of Collapse, which is that moment when the Ming is kind of falling apart, and as we know, retrospectively, indeed collapses and is leading to the conquest by the Manchus. So your hunt for prices eventually leads you into a historical debate that has been going on since day one after the collapse of the Ming, when scholars were sort of obsessed with why did this empire collapse, and has been going on in a quite heated manner for even the last few decades. So I thought it might be nice to hear from you, where you fit in this question that has attracted so many people. Why did the Ming collapse, even if that isn't how you got into it? Partly because it'll help get people a sense of the significance of your findings in this sort of larger historical context.
Well, you're absolutely right. That the data all pointed me towards the last 8 years of the Ming Dynasty. And this is when China went through one of the most remarkable climate downturns in the last, I'd say the last 2 millennia, probably the worst climate crisis China has experienced. Started in around 1637, 38, goes through to 1644, 1645, and the result for the Ming Dynasty is that it collapses. Now, there is a long historiography on the collapse of the Ming, and it sometimes is pinned to the Emperor Chongzhen, who was not hopeless, but he was facing a lot of problems. Sometimes it's pinned on his administrators who were corrupt, who were lining their own pockets, who were failing to do what needed to be done. We also have peasant rebellions that start in the northwest, Shanxi, and eventually move in on Beijing and take the capital in 1644. So we've got all of these elements, but the overarching theme of the historiography is that the Ming failed in some way. I want to revisit that because the idea that the Ming failed, or that Ming officials failed, or that the emperor failed is actually a narrative that the Manchus develop shortly after they take China in 1644. They need a way to tell the Chinese people what's happened to them and why the Manchus should be their rulers. And Dorgon, who led the invasion, who's one of the senior Manchu leaders, made a point of saying, well, Chongzhen was okay. He wasn't a terrible ruler, but the people around him were all corrupt. His military commanders were incompetent. And the reason the Ming fell is not because we Manchus came in and overthrew your regime. It's because your regime collapsed and we came in to provide you Chinese with a new government. So that was the Manchu narrative of the fall of the Ming. And it's a narrative that Chinese took on in the first couple of decades of the Qing dynasty. It was a sort of mea culpa. I, as a subject of the Ming, failed to defend the Ming, failed to keep the Ming emperor on his throne, failed to keep the Ming dynasty alive. And it was a fairly popular narrative position to take. And that is then cast a long shadow all the way into the 21st century. So if you look at textbooks on the fall of the Ming, it's usually corruption, bad administration, failure to keep the postal system and the military system running properly. It's all viewed as failures on the part of the people who served the Ming. But once you realize the scale of the environmental crisis that was going on through the last 8 years of the Ming, once you bring that in, you have to start asking other questions. And that's what I did, because my data on famine prices during the Ming, by far the worst data and the most concentrated data are in those last 8 years of the Ming. And it was the data revealed to me an environmental crisis on a scale that China had never experienced before, and the Ming had never experienced before. And to somehow blame Ming officials for having allowed the dynasty to fall is quite beside the point if you don't bring in the climate. You have to bring this in. And that's why I focused the book on the collapse of the Ming, to provide a different narrative. Now, it doesn't mean that the Ming wasn't having problems. They were having difficulty raising taxes, difficulty maintaining the military, but those are fundamentally fiscal and financial problems, and they were having those problems because there was no grain in the field. There were no taxes to collect. So the climate crisis was causing a huge financial and economic crisis from which the Ming simply did not recover.
Yeah, I think people have, there are arguments that take into account the climate, and there are arguments that take into account economic factors, and I'll ask you about silver in a little bit. One thing I think that might surprise some readers initially is to see price and climate in the title next to each other. It might not be immediately obvious to folks how these things are connected. So I wonder if you could talk about that in a general way. How does climate lead to prices, and how do you use, can prices be used as a proxy for climate issues? a bit about how you get this chain reaction from climate change to that trickles through economic things and then cultural and political. But I'm also though curious about well, maybe I'll save that for the next question. But
Okay.
how you pick out the sort of longer term things from the data versus the short term constant complaining that the historical records do. There are always bad things happening. But yeah,
We,
that chain reaction and the connection between climate and prices.
in an agricultural economy, a pre-industrial agricultural economy, the source of food is what keeps a state functioning, what keeps a society functioning. And when food supplies diminish, if it's a 1 or 2 year bad harvest, the Ming was able to get through that because they had granaries, they had policies for moving grain from places where grain was abundant to places where grain was missing, it was not there. So the Ming administration had ways of dealing with bad harvests. But when you get a bad harvest that goes on for 5 or 6 years, it exhausts the resources of the state. When there is no grain to harvest in the fields, the price of grain skyrockets. And this is the only reason, well, not the only reason, but the usual reason for grain prices to soar is that either the temperatures are too cold, the rainfall is insufficient, or the rainfall is excessive and is washing away the fields in which the grain is growing. And so to get to the, if you like, to get to the foundation of Ming society as an agrarian society, you have to pay attention to agricultural production. And when climate is stripping out the very conditions that allow rice to be grown or millet to be grown in the fields or whatever grains, wherever they're being grown, when you can't grow the grain, then this gets reflected in prices. Now, the prices I've worked with are prices reported in local gazetteers. And I can't entirely say these prices are actual market prices. Sometimes a price is given as much as to say, well, if somebody was going to say, oh, I really like that car, but it's going to cost me $1 million. I mean, clearly a car is not going to cost anyone $1 million, but it's a figure of speech. And so I've had to filter that a little bit in my data. But what I found is that rather than saying, oh, a liter of grain is going to go to 100 copper coins, that became the sort of standard famine price. But then it went up to 200 copper coins. It went up to 1,000 copper coins. And these were prices that people couldn't afford. So what I'm saying here is that grain prices, I think, are an excellent proxy for what the climate is doing to agriculture. And I was curious, I read European history, and I was curious that there's no climate historian of Europe other than there are two German historians who have used grain prices as a proxy for climate change. But generally, grain prices are not used by European historians. And I wrote to Jeffrey Parker about this. I've known Jeffrey for years. He wrote the Global Crisis book, which looked at, if you like, the late Ming as it was experienced in Europe. And I said, I don't find any grain prices in your book. And he wrote back and said, no, I didn't use that data. I had other data that I was using. So for a China historian who has looked at a lot of different factors in the Ming period, it seemed to me that this is going to be our best documentary proxies. Now, we have other proxies as well. There are ice core samples, rainfall reconstructions, climate reconstructions based on tree rings and all that sort of thing. And there are Chinese scientists and others who have been collecting that kind of data. But as a documentary historian, I discovered that what I'd found in local gazetteers was probably the closest proxy you can find for the impact that climate was having on Ming society.
I think that impact is something that is as useful as prices are for sort of putting numbers on things and tracking the severity over time, is something that I think in a lot of authors' hands, the human element of it might have gotten lost. And as an author who's tended to focus on cultural history, a lot on everyday lives and how global phenomena affect people's everyday lives. I think you were a kind of in many ways, ideal person to write about something that readers might expect before reading the book could be sort of dry and economic. And one of the things that I found very exciting about this book was how you bridged economic and cultural history. Economic historians often don't go so deep into culture. Cultural historians often ignore things like prices. And I think this book is really successful at bridging that. It starts off with this wonderful story of one individual's experience of the prices. And so I wonder if you could just talk a little bit about what your strategies were for keeping these really moving and sometimes disturbing accounts of how these prices shattered people's lives at the forefront of the narrative.
Well, I'm not an economic historian. I really can't I have a hard time putting an Excel sheet together. I can't do graphs and charts and all the stuff that economic historians can do. But I'm a historian who reads records of the Ming Dynasty. So what I did, while I accumulated the data that sits in the background of this book, I also tracked the testimonies that Ming people have left us about their experience of going through these catastrophes. There's not a lot for or it's hard to find local writers writing about, say, the enormous turn down in the 1450s, which I call the Jingtai Slough. That was a terrible period, but it's hard to find local writers working on that. But once you get to the late 1630s, there's any number of testimonies that people have written to say, I am going through something that I have never experienced that is beyond anyone's imagination. The number of people who are dying, the diseases that are breaking out as a result of starvation, the dislocation, the poverty. And so that was my focus because you're right, I'm a social and cultural historian. I'm not an economic historian. And so my interest was in understanding, how did the climate downturn affect how people live their lives? Now, I put in a certain amount of economic data, but I have to admit, I'm not 100% proud of my economic data. I really should have worked with an economic historian on this project, but I didn't. And so I used my data in order to talk about how this affected people's experience. And once I started doing that, this became so compelling in order to get that story out. Now, usually stories of the fall of the Ming have to do with soldiers and militias and bandits and all that sort of thing. And instead, I wanted my late Ming stories to talk about drought, flood, starvation, cold weather, the way in which ordinary people experienced the fall of the Ming.
That's great. One of my favorite little vignettes that you include in there is this image of a Ming man talking about people walking by peddlers selling antiques and other luxury goods, which the prices of which have gone to almost nothing, and nobody wants them. And yet the price of one meal worth of grain has become unobtainable, which I think, aside from being a powerful image, also points to the fact that prices in this case are operating a little differently from what economists look at when they're thinking of like deflation and inflation, where prices across the board are moving roughly in the same direction. And that kind of gets you into this long debate about silver in the Ming, because of course silver was the sort of more valuable form of money in the Ming. And there are many arguments, even implying that the Ming may have fallen, may have collapsed due to irregularities in the global silver trade, which then connects the Ming to the colonialism in the New World and all of that. Can you talk a little bit about how you disentangle the effects of shocks in the money supply, which are silver import shocks, from prices, these famine prices that can tell us something about climate?
Right. Well, when I saw what was happening at the end of the Ming, I thought about this question of whether silver coming from the New World or coming from Japan was in some way causing prices to rise. And if you look closely, I'm not sure I ever used the word inflation in the book, because I think you're absolutely right. The concept of inflation doesn't apply. This is an unusual situation in which food prices are going through the roof, and you can buy antiques or children or whatever you want for a very little amount of money. So accordingly, I devote the middle chapter of the book to rethinking the global silver trade. Now, that was an argument that first came into circulation in the 1970s with the work of William Atwell and others. And I was an enthusiast for that when it started coming. And I've built that into some of my other work on the Ming. Certainly, global silver flows were favoring China. The Spanish were forcing native peoples in the Americas to mine silver on a huge scale. They loaded up their ships, sailed them across the Pacific, and then in Manila, they traded their silver for Chinese manufactured goods. And it was a win-win for everybody, because the Chinese wanted the silver and the world wanted Chinese manufacturers. However, the timing of the food price shocks that I was discovering didn't seem to relate at all to the inflow of the silver. And the more I thought about it, and the more I looked for evidence of how silver, particularly flowing into Fujian province, which is where most of the ships were going from Manila, were ending up, I could not find convincing evidence that the silver was coming in and causing an inflation in the local currency. And when you think about it, the Chinese economy is huge, and the amount of silver that you would need in order to disrupt the monetary system was just not coming in on that scale. And by way of reference, there had been a debate about inflation in Europe as a result of silver production in the Americas. And it used to be thought that silver coming into Europe in the 16th and 17th centuries was causing enormous inflation and economic chaos. That's now been revised by economic historians, and they feel that's actually a rather small element that you can't explain you can't explain European economic chaos in the 17th century on the strength of the flow of silver alone. And that's known as the Columbian Exchange. So I talked about the Magellanic Exchange for the Pacific and argued that in a similar way, although a great deal of silver was coming into China, it was not enough to change the overall price regime. And you didn't see other commodities changing in the way in which you saw these grain prices changing. So my conclusion from this is that, yes, we need to track the flow of silver, but the flow of silver is not going to explain why the cost of enough grain to serve a dinner has become impossible for anyone to afford. That silver doesn't explain that. And I have a final section in that chapter which says that the only sector of the economy in which I've been able to find prices rising to exorbitant levels is in the art market. And so my analysis of this is that the silver is coming in, it's being held onto by the wealthiest people in China, mostly merchants. The merchants are then competing with the gentry for antiques and artworks, and that's driving art prices through the roof. But those are the only prices that are going through the roof at the time, other than grain prices during economic collapse. So I certainly think that silver is coming in, that the global flow of silver is important for understanding how China was changing in the 17th century, but it's not sufficient to explain what was happening in those last 8 years of the dynasty.
A related thing that comes up both in the book and when you and I chatted a few days ago is this question of long-term versus short-term changes, which is both important to pay attention to when we're talking about something like the Little Ice Age, which is actually a very long period, much longer than this moment before the Ming collapse. but also perhaps in some of the debates around silver. So I wondered if you would be happy to talk a little bit about the role this distinction plays in your argument.
Yes, I would. The climate is usually a long-term force. And a society like the Ming, which had a reasonably effective bureaucracy, it had policies for dealing with food shortages. They offered merchants subsidies in order to get them to move grain from one place to another. China was a place that was adapting to the long-term changes being brought by the Little Ice Age. But the crises come when there's an intense short-term crisis that existing responses can't deal with. So, as I suggested earlier, you can have a bad year or two and get through it. But if those bad years start running 4, 5, 6 years long, you don't have the means to respond. Even no matter how good your policies, your food supply policies have been, and we need to see most of these periods that I identify through the course of the Ming when grain prices go impossibly high. These are relatively short-term periods, and the Ming administration is able to more or less get through them without the dynasty collapsing. But it's when we get to the late 1630s and 1640s, it just goes on and on and on. And this is a short-term crisis that goes on 7, 8, 9, 10 years and causes the collapse of the dynasty. And I don't want to simplify the reasons for the fall of the Ming dynasty. There are many factors involved, of course. If the Manchus weren't sitting there on the other side of the Great Wall when Li Zicheng and his rebels come into Beijing and the Chongzhen Emperor hangs himself, I mean, all of those elements are part of the story. The Ming wouldn't have collapsed if other factors weren't at play. But I still think that the sort of the dominant factor that you need to bring into this set of catastrophes is climate.
Okay, yeah. And I think I have a little quote from the book here that kind of sums it up. It says, the scale on which you write, the scale on which the climate deteriorated made the fall of the dynasty as irreversible as any morality tale could imagine. Chen Qide, who the example you talk about earlier, credited heaven with the disaster. We credit climate change. That is a pretty strong and firm answer to the collapse question. Is this a sine non qua, like maybe not a sufficient cause, but a necessary cause here, or?
Yes, it's definitely a necessary cause. The reason why I lined up our concept of nature with their concept as heaven is that when Ming Chinese reflected on what was happening to them, the only way they could explain the scale of this disaster was that heaven was acting. And heaven was either punishing the emperor or punishing his officials or punishing the people for their immorality. And they had no other explanatory device to explain why they couldn't grow grain in the fields, why there was no rainfall, why the temperatures were going so cold in the winter. Even there were cold summer temperatures too. Their explanation was heaven, and they then had a sort of calculation to link heaven to the rise and fall of dynasties. And heaven controls the mandate of a dynasty, and if the dynasty loses its mandate, it's because heaven has withdrawn the mandate. So that was a logic that made sense to them, and I refer to it not extensively in the book, but I refer to it in the book. But for us, we don't think that such a thing as heaven is mandating anyone to come to power or lose power. And really, the necessary condition for the rise and fall of dynasties, it's not always going to be climate, but in the founding of the Ming, the founding of the Qing, and arguably the collapse of the Qing as well, climate played a significant role. Now, I'm not saying that we just remove all other explanatory factors, but I'm saying that if climate isn't the sort of the table on which you rest your explanations, you're going to be missing what's going on.
I wonder I'm really glad that you told us why you put this bit about heaven in there, and that it's not just a rhetorical flourish. You're actually pointing to a parallel in the level of significance of the causal thing that we're looking at, and B, a difference between the way we understand these big background causes. I wonder if you could talk a little bit more about your approach to writing on this book, the question of writing. For those who aren't familiar with your work, Professor Brook is widely known as an excellent writer, in addition to being an excellent historian. And so I wonder if this book was different, if the challenge of writing to engage the reader was different in this book, or is it the same? Because, I mean, I think some people talk about good writing as though it's a surface embellishment. But what I often see in your work and in this book is that it is actually tied to the content, in the sense that it's about your work to find what's important, explain it, and find the examples that are persuasive about it. So was that kind of the same in this book, or were there sort of special challenges with this material?
Well, I think the material started out with some special challenges because, as I said, I'm not an economic historian. I had a lot of economic data. And my concern is always that if I don't make it interesting to the reader won't read the book. So I'm always concerned with trying to think, how do I fashion a narrative that is going to be appealing, that is going to draw the reader in, is going to make the reader sympathetic to the analysis that I'm trying to provide. As I said earlier, I assembled this massive project on commodity prices in the Ming, and I just thought, this is not anything that anybody's going to want to read. And I realized that my best data were grain prices during famines, but also my most compelling stories were connected to the crises. And so that's why I decided to start the opening chapter with Chen Qide's memoirs, two memoirs going through the famines in the early 1640s, because he was talking about the things that I think readers would find more compelling. I could have written, how can I put this nicely? I could have written a really boring book in which I lined up all of my data and explained that data. But instead, I decided to push the data a bit into the background and bring the story forward in order to engage the interests of readers. And I have to say, I'm a little surprised at how enthusiastic readers have been about this book. I mean, I viewed this book as a bit of a specialist piece that was only going to appeal to a small readership, and yet it seems to have attracted a wide readership. So I guess I pulled off the writing side of this project better than I thought I would.
Yeah, it's quite a compelling read, I have to say.